All right, so before we get started, I'd just kind of like to do a quick round of introductions because I think we have some new people here. So my name is Nick Hall. I am the abolitionist working group chair of Peoria DSA. I am going to be presenting today for our 7-week training for the ABCs of Socialism. This one is week 6, and I am going over the essay from Socialism Sounds Good in Theory, but doesn't human nature make it impossible? My pronouns are he, him, and I would call on, looks like Noah's next on the list. I'll ask you to unmute.
Hello, my name's Noah. He, him pronouns. Was there a warm-up question or is that just?
Didn't have one thought of, but
Oh, you're good.
Yourself how you want to. And then I got Larry next.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good.
All right. Larry, is this your first time joining us for an event, or?
No, I was on one of these calls a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, cool. And Allison?
Hi, everyone. My name's Allison Galvin. This is my first meeting. My pronouns are her and, oh, I forgot the other one. And she. Sorry about that.
Okay. And then Kyle?
Yeah, my name's Kyle Auer. My pronouns are he, him.
Okay. And then Justin, they kind of like jumped around, so I don't know if I've already called on you, but.
I don't think so. Justin Krakabiachi, he, him. Happy to be here.
Well, it looks like we can get started. I'll try to keep an eye on it and see if anybody else tries to join. But so again, today we're going to be talking about the essay "Socialism Sounds Good in Theory, but doesn't human nature make it impossible to realize?" This is by Adner Usmani and Bhaskar Sankara. This is an essay from Verso Books. It also has an accompanying video presentation by the author. And after today, I would encourage each of you to go view it. It's like 40 minutes. So if you have time to watch like a Netflix show, you'll probably find it really good. But in the interest of building on what has come before, I'd like to explore more deeply some of the themes of the essay and explore ways in which human nature both challenges and is taken advantage of by capitalism, and how we can use our understanding of human nature to build a more comprehensive socialist politics. And so, Noah, if you can go to the next slide. So this criticism of socialism, that it's good in theory and bad in practice, rests on the assumption that people are inherently selfish, competitive, uncooperative, and generally just not nice people. And so it's one that sees humanity under narrow, inherently sinful moralism. American discourse on morality tends to see humans through a lens of original sin. It's based heavily in a Christian theology, and this belief that all humans are born morally corrupt is pervasive in society. We see it play out in things like conservative politics as a call to return to traditional values. And so the appeals by conservatives to return to a moral way of life assumes a set of innate human values that ultimately results in an us versus them mentality by distinguishing good moral people from bad immoral ones. Business owners, bosses, landlords, and politicians exploit the moralistic division and to maintain the current systems of exploitation to pit neighbors against one another. Socialism, however, it rests on the necessity of cooperation, a drive to resist domination, and between human beings working to build a better and more equal community for themselves and their neighbors. Despite the above criticisms, we should not reject critique of human nature. The author makes it very clear that rejection of the existence of human nature makes it impossible for us to reach the realities of a socialist polity. And it's not compelling to the masses, nor is it necessary to reject the existence of a universal human nature. They identify two reasons that understanding human nature, and Noah, if you can go to the next slide. They identify two reasons that understanding human nature is important for us to realize socialist politics. And so one of the reasons is that socialist politics rests on a moral indictment of how societies built under capitalism failed to provide necessities for people who live under them. Only a small percentage of people who live under the system are actually taken care of in a world where scarcity must be manufactured. Where the right to food and shelter and other necessities is based on your ability to pay rather than your need of those things. To reject the existence of human nature denies us the ability to identify humanity's universal drives. And without being able to understand the universal drives of humanity and interpret the world around us, we lose an essential tool in our efforts to change the structures that create our present reality. Second, it also is our task as socialists to determine the conditions necessary to make collective action and mass resistance against oppression a viable choice for even more people. Because the risks of doing so are so high, we have to make the risks of doing the business of collective action and resistance worth it. And so to identify the drivers of social revolution in the face of overwhelming odds. We cannot create a new society that works for the masses if we do not have a more comprehensive understanding of the universal human nature of humans. And so, Noah, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, one more. So what even is human nature? This is the focus of the author's work that I wanted to expand on here. And so I've already explored like a moralistic view of human nature, but I wanted to dive into how biology, psychology, and our relationship with production shape our actions and historical outcomes. How we can use this to generate a strong and successful socialist politics, and where we have seen the conditions necessary for socialism play out successfully. So let's start with the biological deterministic view. This is one that sees human nature reduced to its fundamental biological drives for nourishment, shelter, and security. Our actions are driven by evolution and natural selection, our goal to survive, to reproduce. You know, I find it interesting that under capitalism, it has co-opted the ideas that of Darwinism and evolution to put forth a practice of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest and the markets of the economy. This is a genocidal and eugenicist practice of determining a person's worth based on the amount of dollars they can provide and produce. And it's a direct result of a misinterpretation of Darwinian theories of evolution. Capitalists see humans under these conditions and assume the conditions that it creates to be natural and narrowly focusing on how individuals survive to reproduce rather than the population as a whole. Any failure to thrive under capitalism means that you had bad luck in the realm of evolutionary warfare. These views are flawed in that there are many mechanisms by which animals survive to reproduce and create new life. Most of which those making this argument of survival of the fittest ignore. Natural selection is used by capitalists to justify poverty and neglect of our community members. Those who argue biological determinism of human nature often find themselves making arguments that result in the justification of death of marginalized community members. And they deny the social production of class, race, and gender. If we're to take a biological view of how human nature can be used to understand how we can make a world where socialism is possible, we must first understand that humans are affected by the same types of evolutionary drives of other animals, and the production of the survival of the fittest in a capitalist market is this characterization of evolutionary mechanisms by those in power. So beyond natural selection, there are other types of evolutionary drives: mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow, to name a few. But for the sake of time, I want to focus on one for today: cooperation. This is where groups of organisms work or act together for common or mutual benefits. This phenomenon sometimes defies the logic of survival of the fittest, and scientists don't necessarily agree on whether or not this type of survival is the result of or an effect of evolution. And we can see this kind of behavior in animals like wolves. Next slide, Noah. Where they're able to take down much bigger prey by working together than by working alone. There is a dilemma in hunting as a pack and working together to bring down the big prey, because if one decides that they are not going to participate equally in the hunt, but still share in the spoils of the hunt, then they will benefit more than the other members of the pack, receiving an evolutionary advantage. Some might hear this example and think that I'm referring to the unemployed relying on benefits of the unemployment insurance, but instead I'm actually referring to people like Jeff Bezos, who are members of the pack who reap and lick the carcass clean, leaving only the smallest scraps, but do not participate in that hunt, instead standing on the sidelines. The working class produces the value of their community, and the capitalists, by purchasing their labor value, deem themselves to have a right to the profits of that labor that it produces, and despite the fact that they had no hand in actually producing that value. Humans have survived millenniums of evolutionary warfare, and in the process, developing cooperative behavior. The capitalists present the biggest threat to our continued human survival, as they continue to hoard the hunt while not actually participating in it. But perhaps this doesn't suit your fancy. Personally, as a counselor, I'm drawn to psychosocial perspectives that view human nature through the lens of subconscious socialization and learned behavior. And so I could go on for days about this psychological concepts, but again, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on a narrow example. And so much of psychological study is focused on the individual. There are ideas universal to the psyche of humans that have been discovered. One that capitalism takes heavy advantage of is the phenomenon of negative reinforcement. To talk about this, we need to first discuss positive reinforcement. I think people would think that capitalism keeps people motivated to trade their willingness to work and resist domination for a 40-hour work week, where they get a big paycheck and can purchase the things that they want, and then they can feel good about purchasing the things that they want. This view is inaccurate because positive reinforcement only goes so far. People don't trade away essential parts of themselves and half their life just for fun, just because it feels good. Instead, we see capitalism make use of negative reinforcement by, which is not something like spanking a child, but rather the removal of a painful, fear-inducing or anxiety-inducing stimulus. This works through ways like things like addiction. We see this play out because drugs are so powerful and they work so well at taking away physical, emotional, and mental pain. You'll find that the threat of homelessness and the threat of being unable to put food on your table, the threat of having more kids taken away because you can't keep the lights on and are considered to be neglecting them, is a very powerful negative reinforcer. Capitalism works very well at placing these threats in front of us and then stripping them away through a seemingly benign exploitation. And negative reinforcement, however, is morally neutral, and socialism's concepts of solidarity, cooperation, and collective action to resist oppression can be seen using these tactics of negative reinforcement in a very different way. Take, for instance, the California prisoners' hunger strike, where 4 gangs divided by race came together to fight against the secure housing unit and to end the oppressive torture of solitary confinement. They starved themselves for 40 days and 40 nights, fighting to win better conditions in the prison. Their actions defy conventional logic under negative reinforcement. Why would they starve themselves, possibly to death, And until you consider what the behavior was being reinforced, it's hard to understand. The threat of death from starvation was less terrifying than the continued isolation from their fellow human beings. And so through collective action across all of the supermaxes in California, they managed to put a 2-year cap on the use of solitary confinement, and they also won better conditions in the prison. No, if you can go to the next slide, I think and I think one more. One more. Sorry, I forgot to. And when they continued to put pressure in the courts to end the use of confidential informants, which were unreliable and often incentivized by the prisons to lie. And so I think what we'll find is that collective action can be one hell of a drug. All this said, moral, biological, and psychological study and examination of human nature does not always lead us to answers of how to challenge and address the human condition. Nor does it provide a full answer of how to restructure our conditions through an understanding of human nature. What is missing in our approach to change conditions? With this better understanding of human nature, what actions are needed to create and develop a direct point of our human nature in? And so to answer these questions, we need to incorporate a historical understanding of our current conditions into our analysis of human nature as well. Now, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so to this, we look to the OG, Marx, and his important contributions to our understanding of human nature. Historical materialism is the theory that human societies developed according to how production is ordered, that societies, and in this conversation, human nature, will be shaped by our relationship to production. People will relate to the systems of production as a class, and under this lens, we can see human nature defined in struggle over power, one defined by struggle between the powerful and powerless, not meaning without power, but with less power. More on this later. And over the resources and the wealth of a community. Whether between monarchs and peasants, feudal lords and serfs, the aristocracy and starving masses, enslaved against their enslavers, or workers against the bosses, we see human nature defined by a desperate desire to be free of domination. And as we reshape and retool our relationship to means of production and shift power from the bosses to the workers, we should expect to see a shift in how human nature plays out in the society as a whole. We must use our understanding of history and human nature to contest the resources and wealth of our community, harness its power, and rip what morsels of bread we can from the overflowing baskets of the powerful. If human nature exists, we should argue that it does. Human nature is more complex than can be easily confined under singular definition or model. And so human nature is not an apolitical thing, and it's something to be fought for and fought over. And to reject human nature is to reject the universal drive for humans to derive meaning from our short lives. I'd like to turn now to open up discussion and fan out into breakout rooms. Noah, if you can go to the next slide.
Stop sharing. Sorry.
Where's
My bad. Hold on.
in? Okay. So, so for the first discussion, when we break out into groups, the first task is come up with a group definition of human nature. Work together to discuss with one another what is your view of what defines human nature. I don't know if people are able to unmute. So, okay. So with, in your discussions with your group, and if you're not able to unmute, just raise your hand. I will get you. So what were some of the things that you guys came up with in your group? What were some of the things that you were discussing, or some interesting points? I'm gonna call on Kyle.
You're calling me.
Yeah.
Okay. We discussed quite a few things. So, for one, language. It separates us from a lot of other beings in the animal kingdom. The fact that we can do so much with language, and that's what it comes down to, like being able to be social with other beings in a way that other animals might not be able to without making just noises and sounds, which is basically what language is, but in a different way, I think.
Yeah, and that reminds me of so there's I think it was Paulo Freire talks about how our experience, our understanding of our experience is shaped by the language that we are able to speak. So like the way that I understand the world around me is based on how I speak and think about the world around me. And if my language is limited to only a small set of words, then I am not able to describe the things that I'm experiencing in the world. If I can call on either Allison or Justin, because I think that Kristen said she was in kind of multitasking.
I guess I'll add just a little bit. We actually landed on a similar idea that if you want to argue for the idea that people are entirely self-deterministic, well, then why did we end up with the language structure and the societal structures that we end up with? It's because people are not by nature solely individual creatures. We're more similar to the wolves as a pack animal. We developed in groups, in working together, or else why would we have this complex language structure and all of these social structures that we've built up over the millennia if we weren't meant to be social creatures? It just doesn't make sense. And Allison had a good point from a Freud quote that I am not going to attempt to botch, but that's where we talk about similar things.
You said it was a Freud quote?
I believe it was a Freud quote, if I remember correctly.
What was the
Yeah, it was. Sorry, I'm just trying to go back to my notes because I took notes on what's it called? The essay. So we got to the topic about like individualism, and I read an essay in my political science class in college called Diluted Individualism. And the author suggested, or he uses Sigmund Freud's suggestion about how to be human is to rebel against the vision, meaning the truth. So like, this is how we typically ignore the extent to which we are determined by unknown forces and overestimate our self-control. And I think this is where we kind of, in a way, understood each other, me and Justin. I don't know if it was the same or not, but like for me, I don't fully agree with the argument because it more sounds like an excuse for our behavior. That's just me personally, I think. But again, when we talk about human nature, we talked about like how altruism and morality are both key to talking about that. But again, I just can't accept that we're determined by unknown forces and overestimate our self-control.
Okay. And so yeah, so you're saying like you disagree with like the idea that like human nature is something that's so pervasive that we are not in control of our actions, that we have a lot more control over or did I understand you correctly? Or
Yeah, so like Sigmund Freud, like I said, like his quote, but like the way that the author like kind of argues it is like it makes it sounds like that we can't control ourselves. Like, we can't control our feelings, but we can control our actions. That's how I believe it to be. That's what, like, I was arguing about that part.
Yeah. Yeah, and like within this discussion, and some of the things that we've talked about, like, we do have a lot of control over our actions, but our choices can sometimes be limited by the other people around us or the systems that we interact with. So like I have a lot of choice in whether or not I continue to be employed at a place under our current structure, right? I can choose to go and search for another job, or I can continue to stay at my job. But with the decisions that I'm making about whether or not to stay there, a lot of that is impacted by, I got to keep a roof over my head. I got to continue to work to keep a roof over my head. I've got to continue to work to continue to put food on my table. And if there's nothing in my area that, if the risk of leaving my job means I lose health insurance, if I lose all of these things that could create some really big things for me, like that could be really problematic. I do a calculation of that decision, right? So like I agree that we have a lot of agency in making choices, but when it comes to how we make those choices, and those choices are, I think, influenced a lot by all of the factors that we have to consider when we make those choices, and the limited amount of choices that we can make when those choices are decided by how much money do I have to make those choices, how much do those choices cost me from a monetary standpoint. So yeah, I think a lot of times we do, like you said, overestimate our ability to have our own agency, and like as I understood it, like having our own agency and being able to, like, those social forces or those hidden forces of our subconscious, we don't really think about those when we're making those decisions, but that and how much they play out, because we do have that agency, but those are still there in our calculations of what we're doing. I don't know if that necessarily disagrees or agrees with what you're saying. So for the next, actually, before I move on, does anybody have anything else they want to add? Anything else they've been thinking of?
I actually wanted to throw on to your point of control based on employment. A perfect scenario, I have a couple of friends who are diabetic, and they literally have to have a job that has health insurance, because if not, they can't afford the cost of living for the medication they need to survive. So it's the ultimate control. It's like, well, yeah, you have choices, but all of these choices are going to fit in this narrow, confined structure, because if not, your other choices, you're not going to afford the medication you need to live. So if that's not a level of control over one's freedoms in the structure that we're in, I don't know a better example.
Yeah. And like we are, as individuals, driven towards, like I made like this point that I think I am very much in agreement with, that we're driven to resist domination. We're driven to resist the control, like a control over us. But when our survival is dependent on other people, we have to make those decisions about how much are we willing to give up that level of control over ourselves to work together with others to meet their needs while also meeting ours. And so, yeah, I hope I responded to that way that you find satisfactory. But for the discussion for the next discussion, part of these trainings is the goal is for us to be able to respond to those criticisms of like socialism sounds great in theory, but it doesn't human nature make it impossible. Right. So when in this next breakout room, one of the things that I would encourage you to work on is think about how you might respond to such a criticism, and what things that you can say to address that concern, not simply just rebuking it. So I am going to put us into. So I did hear some really good discussions going on there. I kind of bounced back and forth between the two rooms. And I'd like to kind of, open up discussion to see if anybody wants to kind of talk about some of the things that, some of the interesting points that were made in their groups. And
so I know what me and Justin kind of talked about was kind of like the history of human nature, or the history of humans, are all very socialist. So like thinking back on the hunter and gathering phase of society, I mean, people went out and hunted for the community, brought it back for the community, and everybody in the community ate what was hunted. And then even moving into like the kind of like the settler kind of phase of society where people were doing communal farming, all of that was very, very socialist. And then moving on to like Native American history, I think like just looking back on them, they were definitely socialist. Just talking about like their structure of what their communities were like. So I think like we wouldn't be where we are today without socialism. And just because like we live in a capitalist society, I get like it's so hard to like realize a life without it. But just because we live in a capitalist society doesn't mean that a society outside of capitalism isn't possible, because at that point it's just like a lazy argument.
yeah, something you said there that I wanted to hone in on too is that a lot of those societies that you're providing examples of, their relationship to how they produced the goods, food, items in their community that were useful to their neighbors, to their community members, in their society was very different than ours now. And so those things were, a lot of that behavior was shaped by their relationship to how they produced food and other goods and services for one another. And it wasn't based on private ownership, but rather communal good. I think it was either, I kind of was in that group a little bit less, but I think it was Larry or Allison, Kyle, one of you was making a point that was trying to remember what it was, but I can call on 1A to talk a little bit about some of the things you discussed, because that might jog my memory if you said it, what it was. I call on Larry if you're okay with that, Larry. Or Kyle.
Mute.
I unfortunately was MIA, so either Larry or Allison might have more insight than I would.
Larry,
Well-
we having trouble unmuting.
I'm okay now. Yeah, I think we talked about barriers to communication, about how different perspectives can prevent people from coming to agreement on things. So that, we might have a really good definition of an argument for socialism, and somebody who doesn't have the same perspective can't hear that. That's one of the things we talked about. What else, Allison?
We talked about, you posed a really good question about, even though, like, should we even like communicate if we agree? And I said, yeah, because sometimes we can only agree to a certain degree. And then that even though we agree with each other, we can still educate each other on some other points. So that was another thing that we brought up.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that I wanted to even expand on a little bit more too, was that one of the challenges, even in spaces like this, where people are, joining up because they agree and on this idea that we should create a more equitable society, that we should work collectively to get, together to make our communities better. Even in spaces like this, you're going to find a lot of people disagree with one another. In fact, you're probably going to find more disagreement in these spaces where we have, debates about very distinct but small differences in how we want to approach the politics that we're trying to put forward. And a lot of that is because everybody's coming from different backgrounds. Everybody has different words to describe their experience. Everybody has different sets of values that they've learned growing up in their particular circumstances. And everyone has their own individual priorities, but they're trying to make that work together as a group. And so it can be it can be a real challenge to create a space where that is both an acceptable thing to have a disagreement and to not be uniform in our ideas with one another. But it's really important in spaces, especially on the left, because of the fact that we have so many people from such different backgrounds coming to join up in this collective struggle against oppression. And then this last one, I'm going to keep this all together for this last question. But what are some of the ways that we can envision using a better understanding of how and why humans behave the way that they do, why how human nature is shaped, to direct a strong socialist politics for the masses? If anybody needs clarification on my question, feel free to ask. Kyle, you going?
I just wanted to double check on what the question was real quick.
Okay. How can we take advantage of an understanding of human nature to build a socialist politics? Might be a better way of putting that question.
I mean, communication, right? I guess. I feel like we gotta find a way to communicate our values and what we stand for to other folks, in a way that isn't really as dividing, as difficult as that is, obviously, because it's politics, but framing it in a way that like they would understand where we're coming from, but it's not like we're attacking them. And we're coming at them with like sympathy and some empathy to be like, hey, we're all going through this, and kind of just frame it that way.
Yeah, and so yeah, like trying to find ways to help bridge that gap between how other people interpret that question of what human nature is and how people answer that question, and helping them come to understand that where our values align and intersect with one another. Let's see. Allison or Noah, did either of you have anything you wanted to add?
Can you ask the question one more time?
Oh yeah. So like how can we take advantage of an understanding of human shape socialist politics?
You like broke up at the end. Say that one more time.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my internet was cutting out. How can we take advantage of an understanding of human nature to shape a socialist politics?
I mean, just like everything, it's good to have a unified front, to have those, mission statement, vision, goals out front there, especially if you are wanting to make, social change. So it's important to have that one voice, meaning not one person's voice, meaning all one voice, making sure that, there's no if, and, or buts, so that no one can, go against our beliefs. I mean, everyone would love to have that, so there'd be no arguing. But making sure to have that unification, because if we don't, I mean, it's just, again, going to be complete chaos and destruction. And, it'll turn into all of us having just to survive, not just the ones being oppressed.
And then I just wanted to offer up any final thoughts from Noah, Justin, or Larry.
Yeah, I got one. So like kind of like thinking about that question, like, if we say like human nature is very communal and like, and like the community should work together, I think as socialists, we really need to be out in our community, working for our community, like, and actually like believe or do the things that we say that we believe in. So like using that definition of human nature, and saying it's very communal, we should be out doing like mutual aid, we should be out doing communal farming, we should be out doing all those things in our community to show like this isn't like the capitalist view of human nature is not accurate, because look at what we're doing all of these things for our community, not for our own self-interests. So I think that's like one way that we can look at it.
Yeah, building off of that, not just out in our community, but even in our workplaces, like we can work to create unions, create workers co-ops, to in our tenancies with people that are our landlords. We can even build off of that some more and start to get people to work together to build better conditions in the places where they're living by working together against the private owner of that building, to demand better conditions and better rent costs. And we as socialists, one of our primary tasks is to show people just how much better our vision of what our communities can look like can be. And it can't be some abstract strategy of, oh, we're going to get this specific policy and this is how it's going to benefit you. We've got to show people in the immediate, in that exact moment, this is why what we're putting forward is going to benefit you and all of all of the people that live alongside you, your family, your friends, your neighbors. Unless anybody else has any final thoughts, that is all I've got for you guys today, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you.